Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this early bird webinar in partnership with Merck Sharp and Dohme. It's our first early bird of 2022. My name is Dwayne Schultes. I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation. Thank you very much for being with us today. Now, before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're having trouble with your audio and you're trouble with your computer connection, you can switch to the phone. That little button next to the mute, that little arrow, you can push that, this menu comes up, and you can switch to one of the several dozen telephone numbers we've provided. As well, we will be taking your questions. We very much want to hear from you. Push the Q&A button. That'll bring up this box and you can submit a question, and we'll be very happy to take it as we move through this very short 30-minute webinar. So please get them in quickly so we have a chance to answer them. And again, thank you very much for being here today. Participating in a clinical trial for a new medicine can provide hope for cancer patients. However, access to clinical trials across borders remains challenging, even in the European Union. Patients face high cost, language and cultural barriers, and must deal with additional legal uncertainties. The good news is a broad consensus currently exists among European institutions, researchers, and cancer patients that enabling access to clinical trials across borders is of vital importance. Also, Europe's Beating Cancer Plan presents an opportunity to facilitate cross-border trials. What are the practical challenges for patients and researchers to enable cross-border trial participation? How can Europe's Beating Cancer Plan facilitate better legislative, administrative, and regulatory frameworks? And what are the best practices that can help find solutions fast enough for patients in urgent need of new treatments? And with that, I'm very pleased to be joined by two exceptional panelists today. I'd like to first introduce to the stage Dr. Ingrid Klingman, who's the chairman of the European Forum for Good Clinical Practice. Ingrid, thank you very much for joining us today. How are you?
Thank you very much. Good morning, Glenn, and thank you for getting the opportunity to participate in this discussion this morning in a topic that is very close to my heart.
Well, thank you very much, Ingrid, and it's great to be with you. It's been a long time. I haven't seen you for a while.
Right.
Hopefully, we'll see each other soon where we can have a coffee. I'd also like to introduce everyone to Jan Geisler, who's the founder and CEO of Patvocates, a very well-known leading patient advocacy organization here in Europe. Jan, thank you very much for joining us, sir. How are you?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me as a patient representative and cancer patient. It's brilliant, and it's really a topic close to our hearts. So thank you so much for raising that and discussing it today.
Well, and it's particularly important to you, which we'll get to, as someone who's participated in trials and is also a cancer survivor. So thank you for being here. Now, Ingrid, I'd like to quickly start with you. In 2019, you were part of the research consortium that European Forum for Good Clinical Practice led, that advocated for the development of guidelines and best practices to facilitate cross-border clinical trials. What has been achieved, but yet what still needs to be accomplished right now? Where are we?
Yeah, in fact, it was a very interesting program. It was initiated by FPI's oncology platform. They raised the question, how relevant, how frequently is it really happening that patients participate in clinical trials abroad? What are the hurdles? Why is it not happening probably as often as it could? So we brought together with this grant from FPI, we got a consortium together, including Patvocates, including the University of Leuven, including EORTC and EFGCP. And our aim was to understand the reality. Is it really happening, and is it really considered relevant? And if it is relevant, why it is not happening more frequently? And we did a survey based on about 40 interviews with experts in all different European countries and all different disciplines. And based on the experience we got from there and the information, we then created a survey that was answered by 400 people, completely evaluable survey responses from all over Europe. And what came out was really very interesting insofar that over 90% of all the stakeholders that we asked, so industry, investigators, patients, ethics committees, regulators, all said it's very important. But de facto, it's happening very, very rarely. And it's simply because there are too many hurdles, too many organizational, financial, legal, language hurdles that would need to be sorted out to make that more frequently happen.
But isn't there a desire, isn't a lot of this done because if you're living in a country that doesn't have a leading cancer center, but yet you have a very strong Senator, wouldn't you want to be able to facilitate that in order to be able to go to the best treatment you can get, even if it's a drive?
Yeah, I mean, especially in very innovative research, the clinical trial centers are mostly in Western European countries who are particularly well equipped, where experts are located. So it is certainly primarily an interest of patients in countries that do not have access to centers in their own country, which is mostly Southern and Eastern European countries. But there are also, there's quite a bit of interest, and that was also some surprise, even in countries where there are good centers, patients prefer to go to another country, either because the clinical trial site is closer to their home, although it is beyond the border, or the other center has a higher scientific reputation.
Sure. I'd like to bring in Jan now. Now, Jan, you're a rare breed. You're someone who is actually a cancer survivor who also runs a patient organization. And again, thank you for joining us today. You joined after a phase 1/2 diagnosis. You're the founder of PatVicates. What is your experience with cross-border trials yourself? What's your position on this as a patient?
Well, why is it important, and why do I feel this is really a challenge from different points? You mentioned that I've been on a phase 1/2 trial when I was diagnosed some time ago, and I actually traveled 400 kilometers a week to actually be part of that trial, because the investigational therapy that I wanted access to was not available in anything close to me. And even though this was not cross-border, so I didn't have the administrative burdens or hurdles that are usually there, I can tell you that no patient would actually travel 800 kilometers a week just because, or without a very good reason. So of course, cross-border makes things more complex. And why would patients do that? I mean, they would do it because they have a rare disease or a disease where there's no existing treatment close to them, or when all available lines of therapy have been exhausted, or when the treatment is not being reimbursed locally, so they think to go to a different country, or when there's a technology that they cannot access in their own country, like genome sequencing, proton beam therapy, and so on. So there are a lot of reasons, but for patients, it's tough. Because they need to travel, they need to live somewhere, when they're on the trial, or they need to drive for very long, and they might be, as cancer patients, very vulnerable, very tired, and can't bear with the burden that is there. So they will only do that if there's a very good reason. I think the numbers of cross-border access to healthcare generally show the patients only do that if it's really important. And of course, it's a problem we would love not to have, because if trials were run in every country, then cross-border access to clinical trials would be necessary. But this is even more far away than enabling clinical trials across borders, just because we see the inequalities in the footprint of clinical trials across Europe, and especially in Eastern Europe, where we have data, and where we, as the work group of European Cancer Patient Advocacy Networks, are now collecting more data on trial footprint. But in general, I think this is really important, because patients have good reasons to go across countries, because they need to go into a center where, let's say, the newest therapies are there. Because in contrast to healthcare systems, patients have one single life. They have one shot. If they can't use that, I mean, they won't make it. And that's why they go cross trials. And we need to facilitate that to make sure we can run research and serve the patients with access to innovation.
That's great, Jan. Thank you again. Just to remind everyone, we will take your questions. Please use the Q&A button, and we'll happily incorporate any questions you have. Now, you both participated in this study that Ingrid had spoken about earlier. What were some of the key takeaways? If you could just solidify one or two key points that are potential places where we can get a quick win in this to potentially help facilitate cross-border trials, what would those be, and what would you think would be the first and second thing that we could try and attack? Ingrid, I'll come back to you here. What do you think would be the low-hanging fruit, as it were?
I think the most important would first be the information, the awareness raising that it is possible to cross-border to go to cross-border trials, but under certain conditions. And so explaining what are the conditions, what are the hurdles, what to care about would certainly make it more attractive for patients, but also for investigators, because we also saw in our research that for investigators, it would be a very important opportunity to get their studies faster together, ultimately also then for the sponsors to get a drug faster to the market, because the trials can be done faster. So helping altogether patients in that community generally. But so the awareness raising and the information about what is possible and what to care for and what best practice examples we have also, for example, that would be a low-hanging fruit for me. The higher, the other one, the much more difficult one, is the legal framework, the regulatory framework that would have to be changed.
And Jan, from your perspective, what was the one thing or a couple things that you think would be easiest to implement from a patient perspective that could actually help this?
Well, I think I'll probably pick up what Ingrid also said, low-hanging fruit in the longer term. I mean, changing the framework, the legislative framework, and facilitating that from a legal sense is the long-term goal. But we know with the clinical trials regulation, it has taken us over 10 years to revise the legislation, and we cannot afford to do this. But we, of course, see, especially from our research, the responses from sponsors and from those running studies, that the hurdles are great and the administration is apparent. But I would say one of the key outcomes, what I found extremely interesting, is that the top ranked thing was actually not legislation, it was access to reliable and information. And I mean, if you don't know that you can cross borders, if you're not using the current frameworks by establishing clinical trials, by making sure the insurance requirements are met, by making sure that the informed consent is available in the right language, if we were willing to do cross-border access to clinical trials, we could do a lot under current frameworks, but it barely happens. And that has to do with information and with, for example, the disinterest of the current national contact points to actually facilitate cross-border access to clinical trials. And patients don't know that trials are going on probably in a nearby country, and it's not being facilitated under the current framework. And that was quite telling, I think, in the research that we did, that access to information is the primary problem.
Yeah, in the context of European legislation, I mean, the cross-border health directive in general is seen as problematic just for general levels of care. Now we're adding another layer of difficulty with clinical trials. Is there anything within the Beating Cancer Plan as it stands now that can help facilitate this? I've read the plan. It seems to me it's much more looking at research more broadly than actually specific treatment. Anything you want to add, Jan? Is that reading correct?
I think on one hand, yes. On the other hand, there are a couple of hooks, but of course we need to make them or make use of them. I mean, on one hand, if you connect the Beating Cancer Plan and the Cancer Mission, you have the inequalities register, which is being established, and this can actually provide an evidence base on the issue to generate more evidence around the challenges of accessing innovative therapies and clinical trials. Why should inequalities only measure current accessible therapies which have been approved, but also access to clinical trials? Then the buildup of the Knowledge Center for Cancer, which is part of the Cancer Plan, is extremely important because, again, it can facilitate research. The EU network of comprehensive cancer centers. I mean, if we connect the excellence centers better, maybe then also in academic research, cross-border access to clinical trials can be facilitated. And then the whole initiative about innovative cancer diagnosis and treatments, there's a hook in there. I have great hopes on the implementation group that is now being set in place for the Cancer Mission, that they can make these things happen, but we just need to make sure that they have access to clinical trials across borders on their radar and don't just think about, current treatments and their availabilities as they are approved.
Sure, thank you, Jan. Now, Ingrid, we're in the Brussels bubble as it is, and it seems like most of the discussion around the European Cancer Plan still is engaging around cross-border HTA. How do we actually get this more practical to the standpoint of allowing room for patients to be able to get more, not just access, but also better treatment and trial participation? What would be needed to get that loop crossed in the actual plan?
On one, oh well, it's certainly multi-layer. One area
Sure.
is certainly what Jan was just saying. The oncologist community, the physicians community, is one area that we should really address, because we have also learned that a lot of patients are not told by their oncologists that there are clinical trials, or where those clinical trials would take place. So there's certainly still a lot to do on making awareness, creating attractivity, or making it more attractive for oncologists to inform themselves about clinical research, and also to make a broader layer of oncologists accept that clinical research is a part of patient care. Because especially in those patients who have no treatment alternative anymore, this is the only option for care. And therefore, I think it's really important that this is made much more aware on the oncologist side, but also on the regulator side. I have looked into the report of the public consultation of the Access to Healthcare Directive. And although we had made a submission of the results of our study and a proposal to include the topic of clinical trials into a potential revision of that healthcare, that was not even mentioned in the report. Yeah. So neither as a topic nor the attachment that we made, all the other attachments are listed there. So they took the topic out. It is not in that context of any relevance at this stage. So I think here we need to do more awareness work if ever possible. And also when you look into the Beating Cancer Plan, at least as much that I could see, it is all about treatment and access to treatment, but not about clinical research being part of treatment.
Do you think there's some hope with what's going on in the European Parliament to try and drive something along what's been published? There's been several proposals coming out of the Parliament. Is that a potential angle, do you think, that this may get some traction in that fashion?
Difficult for me to judge on, to be honest, because I think every angle that we can find to get the awareness rising or raising about that topic and the interest in making it happen. There was also one discussion was about who should pay for it, because there are additional costs. And although the pharma companies that were interviewed and participated in the survey were showing quite a lot of willingness to find here financial solutions, especially the academia was seeing here big problems, because about 40% of all clinical trials are sponsored by academia, so publicly also, and there is hardly any budget for that. So they were very much concerned that putting, so to say, the full burden on the sponsors in general would make this type of research impossible for them.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a comment. Yeah, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe just one more addition, because I think it's really important. The European Parliament has a crucial role to play here, because of course the Commission has the Beating Cancer Plan and the Cancer Mission, but we could see in the Becker report that they actually published about the Cancer Plan that a lot of new aspects came up. For example, rare cancers didn't even appear in the Cancer Plan until the Parliament really made everyone aware about it. And I mean, they are the elected representatives from, let's say, people in all the different EU countries. They sit on the parliament. So, of course, they have a different perspective on taking care of patients which are in their countries and which have these challenges to cross borders and so on. So I think only linking, let's say, the European Commission in Brussels with the member states on the council level and in the parliament actually can make a difference on these kind of cross-border things. It's extremely important. So I think they have a crucial role to play, and we saw interesting things in the Becker report when they published it some weeks ago.
Yeah, it was December 4th when the report came out. Obviously, I think a lot of these issues with the debate coming around the clinical trials directive being opened up and some of the orphan drug discussions going on, I think it's kind of a third rail discussing these issues, unfortunately. But you're right. I think it needs to be brought up immediately, particularly with all the innovation that we're seeing in new treatments. Is there any hard data? Do you have any sort of numbers about access from the surveys you ran? Is there anything that sort of jumped out from the actual feedback you received in the report? Ingrid, you're shaking your head. Yes,
yeah.
please.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is not a comprehensive research that we could do there with this unrestricted grant, but what we saw was that we had asked the investigators how many of their studies include patients from abroad, and that was clearly beyond 1%.
Mm.
So it's really, really very rarely happening. And that is also the problem then from a practical point of view, because that means when such a patient comes, a lot of administrative things have to be done by the study team, by the site team, and they are all anyway completely stretched, especially now in Corona times. So this additional burden is really also not very much welcomed, so to say, by the study teams, because the situation is not prepared for such patient requests.
Yeah, and you wanted to jump in, please.
Yeah, I mean, probably just ask responding also to your questions about numbers. And I mean, of course, the sample was relatively small because we did interviews, but via the work group of European Cancer Patient Advocacy Networks, in which we have the 23 pan-European cancer patient umbrellas, we made sure that there's a, let's say, participation from all different regions in Europe, and their experienced advocates, which are also patients which responded. And about 1/3 of the responses in that survey were from the patient community. And I found it very alarming that 44% of the survey respondents had no experience with cross-border access to clinical trials, and only a very, very, very small percentage actually had personal experience with cross-border access to clinical trials. If 44% of the patient advocates which take part in the survey have no experience with cross-border access to clinical trials, it makes very clear that there's no information, and even the advocates don't know how it works. So how can patients actually find their way, even if we offer it to patients, and even if the, let's say, legal and administrative challenges are being met, which I think they can, then even the advocates don't know how to do it. And I think there's a huge gap here. That's an informational gap and a coordination gap that we need to fill, because the patient organizations are usually the first place where patients land after their appointment with the doctors. And we can provide a huge role there to navigate patients as well.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, even the cross-border health directive in general is seen as a difficulty for people just trying to go to another hospital across, even though it's technically allowed for budgetary reasons in particular. It's an administrative nightmare. And speaking of administrative nightmares, Mark Dooms has chimed in with a rather provocative question. Thank you, Mark. Can we still do clinical trials under cross-border healthcare in the UK after Brexit? Thank you, Mark, for bringing in a really difficult question. Ingrid, any idea how does this work now in the UK? What has stayed as legislative possibility and what is now gone after Brexit?
Well, I think in that aspect, I would not see any big differences, because from wherever you come, wherever you go in another country, you are in another healthcare system, and you have to find your way in that other healthcare system. I mean, we have a lot of patients who go to not a lot of patients, but we have patients who go to the US for their treatments, which is also a very different healthcare system. And in fact, those patients who do that pay for it themselves. And I think that would be the same situation in the UK. If you can get into such a trial and you can pay practically everything for yourself, you still can do that also after the Brexit.
Yeah, and have you had any communication with your UK colleagues? Is any idea what's going on?
Well, of course, we as cancer patients are extremely worried about the inequalities that Brexit is actually generating. I don't want to go into the politics and the pitfalls of that, but I'm really worried, because we can already see that the whole regulation around the European health card and patients, let's say, going to EU countries from the UK or vice versa and getting standard healthcare there. I don't want to imagine what the challenges will be for UK patients going to continental Europe or vice versa for clinical trials. This is a nightmare. And I think the whole thing has been to the total detriment of patients on both sides of the channel. It's a nightmare. Of course, we patient organizations try to help where we can. We do not differentiate. We don't have walls in our brains, whether people are from one country or the other. And we are very experienced in helping also patients outside of the EU zone, on all sides, south or east, whatever. So we're very determined to help, but this is a nightmare.
Is there anything we can take away or anything we can learn, any lessons gained from COVID, maybe what not to do? Is there anything that we can take as a lesson there? Jan, any ideas about what are best practices maybe we can learn from COVID?
Well, of course, I mean, COVID has told us, because people couldn't go to the clinics, they couldn't actually have their follow-up appointments and studies, that we were just suddenly going into a flexibility in clinical trial protocols that we've been calling for years, but we're always told that's impossible. And I think with remote monitoring, with home nursing, with sending samples by postal mail instead of queuing up for 3 hours in the clinic to get a blood draw, I think we now have seen it's possible. And this could facilitate a cross-border access to clinical trials a lot. So patients travel for enrolling on the study, they travel for specific therapeutic or diagnostic interventions, but they don't need to be there every 2 weeks. So anticipating that in the clinical trial protocols probably will make the administrative burden for the centers and also for healthcare system much less if they can, let's say, have parts of the clinical trial at their home place and not when traveling every 2 weeks to the clinical trial center. That just comes to my mind. COVID has been quite helpful on that, if there's anything good about COVID.
Yeah, Ingrid, European Forum for Good Clinical Practice. Anything you folks have touched on related to COVID about using as best practices or avoiding?
Yeah, I mean, we see also that a lot of so far thought impossible elements have been changed very simply during COVID times. Even inspectors and auditors are now doing work remotely that they would have never imagined that it would be possible to do it remotely. So we have certainly seen a move of one of the requests or results of that work also that we did, which was bring the studies closer to the patients.
Sure.
More sites in more countries, which is a logistic issue. Now with a clinical trial regulation, it will be easier to start a clinical trial in several countries because there is now this coordinated assessment procedure, and it does ultimately not make a big difference whether you go into 3 countries or in 6 countries with your trial, as long as there are investigators who are willing and able to do the work. So I think we have here a somewhat different framework now that we should really utilize as much as possible, and also the flexibility and willingness to bring activities closer to patients' home to make it less burdensome. But I think we still have to solve a lot of issues concerning creating the framework also then for long-term follow-up treatment, for example, and who is providing the data that is collected then in the long-term follow-up at home, and who is caring for the long-term follow-up home costs, etc. There are still a lot of things that we in the EU still would need to sort out quite quickly.
Yes, and unfortunately, we're not going to solve them all now, and we are down to our last 2 minutes. Half hour goes very quickly, as our first webinar 2022 has shown. Quickly, just from both of you, just a real quick question. If you could implement one thing tomorrow, if you could make one thing occur to facilitate cross-border clinical trials, what would be the one regulation or thing you would like implemented to make happen immediately? Jan, I'll start with you. What's the one thing you would like to do if we could immediately?
I mean, immediately, I would say create a proper evidence about access to clinical trials that you know when you can actually, or you can inform patients about how to cross and where to cross and what is being on offer. We don't know which trials offer cross-border access at the moment, just because nobody collects the data, and clinicaltrials.gov and EudraCT doesn't tell that to us, whether the, let's say, conditions are being met. So if I have a very short-term wish, I would say we need to get the evidence right, that we know which trials offer cross-border access, that we can tell patients this option is there.
Should patients do that? Do you think patients should band together and put something up? Is that possible?
Well, we as WECAN are now starting research on clinical trial footprints in all the different cancers that are represented in our 23 umbrella organizations. And we're working on that research now. And at least we're trying to do our own homework. But of course, this requires funds, which we often don't have.
Sure.
So I think we need more help in collecting the evidence. And that's where European bodies must come into.
Thank you. And Ingrid, last word to you. What's the one thing you would like to implement?
Well, I think the most helpful in practical terms would really be a compilation of the practical aspects on how to make it happen. We have best practice examples. We have recommendations what to look at for sponsors, for investigators, for patients, to compile that in a clear and logically and comprehensive way would probably a first very important step to make it happen. From a regulatory point of view, practically, we have the new CTIS database for clinical trials now in Europe, but that does not contain the information that Jan has just mentioned. It does not show which studies are, they can be found there, but it does not show which studies are open for cross-border access.
And maybe that's something we can look at. Ladies and gentlemen, we are officially out of time. It's our first early bird of 2022. Thank you very much for being here. I'd like to thank my participation from my colleagues here. Ingrid, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
And Jan, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And for our audience, thank you very much. Have a good morning and bye-bye. Have a good week.